Okay, so I wanted to kind of continue this series on political theory today by looking specifically at this problem of political myth. And within that frame, honing in on a kind of idea of political myth introduced by a thinker named Ernst Cassirer. And in particular, we're going to look at Cassirer looking at Machiavelli on this question of myth. So we're going to do this kind of telescoping maneuver and analyze the basic kind of political theory involved, and hopefully kind of walk away with an interesting conclusion. So looking at this problem of political myth within Ernst Cassirer's greater thought, we can begin by saying that though his background was situated in the hard sciences, Cassirer's philosophical neo-Kantianism led him to complete a three-part survey of the phenomenon of myth between the years 1923 and 1929. Cassirer frames the problem of myth largely in terms of a priori categories roughly parallel to and derived from Kant's notion of the transcendental. For Cassirer, this means that myth operates at the same architectonic level as do other symbolic forms, such as music, art, and even history. They are framing categories of apprehension that enable the veridical and juridical aspects of knowledge to emerge in their separate, though interconnected domains. What distinguishes these genres of symbolic form from one another are the structuring truth conditions unique to each system. In this manner, each claims a different status and method of truth, inviting a basic pluralism of human world creation and world apprehension. From these grounds, Cassirer builds an evolutionary historical model of myth development that appropriates aspects of Hegel's universalizing historicity. This in part means navigating between treating myth as a mere function of the conscious and subconscious, popularized by Freud, and seeing myth as an expression of a higher metaphysical principle, reflecting something of Schelling's influential notion of the absolute and its unfolding through history. According to Cassirer, myth develops concurrently with language, as both share an immediate structural generality predicated on existential confrontations with externality. The myth is set to explain concrete rituals of human activity, to plug the conceptual hole that justifies and subdues where there was otherwise only the cacophony of mere activity. In this manner, the pulse of myth is ever present, though subject to transformation and dynamic fluidity across time and space. Cassirer's rendering of myth is an important one. Interestingly, in Cassirer's earlier career, he had fashioned this theory of civilizational history along a trajectory of symbolic development, with reason and science trumping myth as a necessary but only initial phase. Myth thus came as an early stage in a greater sequence of general progress, with the promise of rationalization and demystification brought by the burgeoning sciences, operating as a theoretical force capable of extinguishing the ignorance associated with mythic worship. By his later career and the development of the myth of the state in 1946, however, the impact of Nazi propaganda and Cassirer's proximity to the ensuing mobilization of the masses had dramatically altered his original thesis. Writing right after the war's conclusion, Cassirer's experience led him to a radical redeployment of the myth's political relevance. Quote, "It has been reserved for the 20th century, our own great technical age, to develop a new technique of myth. Henceforth, myths can be manufactured in the same sense and according to the same methods as any other modern weapon, as machine guns or airplanes. That is a new thing, and a thing of crucial importance. It has changed the whole form of our social life." End quote. Cassirer's rendition yields critical insights that illuminate the process by which the pre-political mode of myth-making operates. Cassirer sees this novel technique of the myth as clearly hazardous and something to be approached with great caution. This is understandable, given his insistence on the manufactured nature of its strategic and explicit use within the skeleton of fascism. While the myth originally developed in tight structural symbiosis with the symbolism of linguistic signs, by this later turn, what stands behind the myth is the nudity of conscious manipulation. Cassirer ultimately bridges this by linking his original semi-ontological treatment with a political lens he finds in Machiavelli. While for Cassirer, Machiavelli inaugurated the first political science, Machiavelli also relied on the use of myth in a novel, secularized manner. Breaking with the King's Mirror literature of the Renaissance and perfecting Guicciardini's much less robust realism, Machiavelli developed the terms of a unique political discourse as autonomous from the religious and ethical currents otherwise seen in his era as intrinsic to the political model. This break meant a particularly ambivalent treatment of the myth for Machiavelli. While rejecting Christianity as the enervation of Roman virtù on the one hand, Machiavelli also saw the right kind of religion, say in the hands of a Pompilius Numa, as a magnificent political tool. The measurement of a good versus bad use, according to Cassirer, is related to the development of the common good, a theme most prevalent in the shift Machiavelli makes from the prince to his discourses on Livy. The autonomization of political knowledge from the sphere of the ethico-religious is itself a simplification of sorts. The secularized myth is now seen as a political tool, to be designed and wielded as a means to particular ends. Machiavelli thus developed the myth of Fortuna, according to Cassirer, within these instrumental means of a cool and distanced rationality. It is at this juncture that Machiavelli links the myth to his early but deep version of political judgment. Here is Cassirer commenting on Machiavelli's notion of prudence, derived from virtù. Quote, "The prince explains tactical rule for this great and continual battle against the power of fortune. These rules are very involved, and it is not easy to use them in the right way, for they exclude two elements that exclude each other. The man who wishes to stand his ground in this combat must combine in his character two opposite qualities. He must be timid and courageous, reserved and impetuous. Only by such a paradoxical mixture can he hope to win the victory. There is no uniform method to be followed at all times. We must be a sort of Proteus, who from one moment to another can change his shape. Such a talent is very rare in men." End quote. Note here Cassirer's insistence on the paradoxical mixture involved in this Machiavellian prudence. The prudent ruler, apart from recognizing and seizing the appropriate occasion, must be a creature of unbound adaptability. Indeed, it is in the resultant impossibility of such a consistent ability that the myth of Fortuna seems to truly emerge. Here is Machiavelli's own 2 points on the reasons that sustain man's perennial political failure. Quote, "There are 2 reasons why we cannot change ourselves. First, because we cannot oppose the ways in which nature inclines us. Second, because once a man has truly prepared by means of one method of procedure, it is impossible to convince him that he can benefit by acting otherwise. As a result, it happens that fortune varies for a single man, for she changes the times while he does not change his ways." End quote. A definitive shift occurs between the more optimistic virtù of chapter 25 of The Prince and this more defeatist, deterministic tone of the discourses. Of course, we may reduce this difference to the intended audience. No longer is Machiavelli writing to Lorenzo de' Medici with the rhetorical flair of the, quote, exhortation to liberate Italy, end quote, chapter that closes The Prince, but with a tempered compassion for a republican virtue. The point, nevertheless, remains. Machiavelli's insistence on the protean adaptability of the prudent prince is constrained by the natural characteristics he himself retains. It is here that comparisons between this Machiavellian idea of judgment and the fate of Sophocles' Oedipus are most germane. We find in both the tragic irony that it is the very traits that lead to our success which further ensure our downfall. The truly practical virtue, to yield adaptable aggression, is to constantly be in the business of changing and overcoming oneself. That men do not achieve this level of dynamism and rather sink into habit and convention engages the very contradictions Cassirer drew out. It is against the backdrop of this natural inability that Fortuna develops as the Machiavellian political myth. Behind every act thus stands the grin of fortune. And though we may indeed, quote, build banks and embankments and dikes, end quote, as precautionary measures against it, the unchangeability of man's nature means only that today we meet success and tomorrow we meet ruin. To avoid the nihilism therein, the impossible insecurity brought about by such a fracture, the myth, as political tool, closes the gap and cancels the question. This leads to the second and most important element we may draw from Machiavelli and from Cassirer's treatment of Machiavelli. Note Machiavelli's observation that part of the problem of political judgment is the fact that once a man is convinced of a successful method, it will be impossible to convince him that he can benefit from acting otherwise. I want to dwell on this aspect of convincing, as it is precisely where the program for the myth is first developed. Machiavelli's realism, reducible as it is to the capacity to observe and describe that this is what people actually do, here animates its own political psychology. Men are stubborn, obstinate, and having found a route that works, grow narrow in their range of action. It would seem that Machiavelli implicitly associates this deficit with the resources of reason. The natural obstinacy of a man disables reason-based convincing, for what can be said to one so committed? Cassirer's real contribution regarding Machiavelli hinges on this last point. The myth is sustained in the Machiavellian cosmos of effectual truth to the extent that the empirical reality of human politics includes the psychological faults of human creatures. Convincing these creatures is impossible. The real business of political pedagogy is rather conducted in terms of the myth. Taking political realism seriously means taking seriously the more trenchant motivational deficits of politics. And for Machiavelli, this means locating the true registrar of motivation far deeper than the cool speculations of reason. Quote, if reason has failed us, Cassirer begins, there remains the ultima ratio, the power of the miraculous and mysterious, end quote. Cassirer continues, explicitly distancing reason-based processes from the subaltern emotional work of myth. He argues, quote, myth does not arise solely from intellectual processes. It sprouts forth from deep human emotions, end quote. What Cassirer feared most about myth was here advanced in full. The model of progress he had developed earlier in his career, where reason had ultimately won against myth, was radically unfeasible in the face of this psychological certainty. Words, arguments, debates, nothing could withstand the deluge brought forth by the mythic image, the animate Volk developed by Herder, the symbol of a purified unity that would come to define the politics of the will and disastrously subsume all the deliberations of the Weimar period as so much Semitic decadence. Cassirer asserts it is beyond the power of philosophy to destroy the political myths. A myth is, in a sense, invulnerable. It is impervious to rational arguments. It cannot be refuted by syllogisms, end quote. What did Cassirer see actually motivating men? Not so much self-interest, and certainly not reason. It was the existential yearning for meaning, for purpose, answered with terrifying theatricality. It was this theatricality that operated on a level distinct from the mere feudalisms of deliberation. Cassirer's conclusion mirrors something like William James's earlier argument for the relation between belief and knowledge, where James observed, quote, "Not only as a matter of fact do we find our passional nature influencing us in our opinions, but that there are some options between opinions in which this influence must be regarded as an inevitable and as a lawful determinant of our choice," end quote. The compulsion of this necessity and lawfulness was, for Cassirer, the permanent domain and continuous labor of myth. It's in this manner that he treats Machiavelli, and it's in this manner that I believe Cassirer, we can see and read Cassirer developing the best kind of treatment of Machiavelli in his kind of broad oeuvre of thought. Thank you, and I hope you got something out of today's discussion. Take care.